You're going through lava fields just before that, and a bit after. You're getting bright red dirt. You're getting super dark dirt. You're getting ponderosa pines. It's really incredible, really, the different types of terrain and flora that you get to see.
Episode 303. Graham Hiemstra talks about bikepacking the Oregon Outback Trail. You're listening to the Adventure Sports Podcast, brought to you by 180 Tech. We talk with adventurers from around the globe to bring you the inspiration and motivation you need to get started in the outdoors or to keep you moving if you're already there. Now here's your host, Kurt Linville.
Hey friends, thanks again for listening to the Adventure Sports Podcast. Kurt here. I have Graham Hiemstra with us today, and Graham grew up in Portland, Oregon. He went to high school in Seattle, but eventually moved to New York City, Brooklyn, to be exact. He's been there for some while, and it's kind of a neat background because you think of New York City and then you think of outdoor adventure, and they seem juxtaposed pretty widely there, but Graham recently completed a bikepacking trip on the Oregon Outback Trail, 364 miles in about 6 days, and it sounds fascinating. For one, I'm unfamiliar with the trail, so I want to hear all about it. And for two, Graham says it got pretty gnarly. I want to hear exactly what happened. So welcome to the program, Graham.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I have to say too, Graham, today is Eclipse Day, and so our listeners are going to look back and say, oh, really? Well, that was a few weeks ago or whatever, right? But for me, it's happening right now in Colorado, and I'm looking out my window while I'm talking to you, and I don't know what the sun looks like from Mars, never been there, but I imagine it's something like this, because the sun is about half gone right now, and the light is really silvery and gray looking. It's just kind of freaky. So when does the eclipse hit where you are?
We've got about another hour and change until we get the closest we're going to get. But my folks are back in Portland, Oregon, and it's already passed through there. They've been telling me of all the madness that's been going on. I think they expected 1 million out-of-state visitors or something. But, you know, it was smooth sailing for them, at least. They stayed home smartly.
Well, I don't really understand why this eclipse is so different from others, except that it's complete in a lot of places in the United States. But I remember an eclipse that happened a few years ago that was probably 75, 80% or something like that. We're only going to hit 85 where we are here. So really, this is very similar to me as the one that happened just a few years ago. But for some reason, America woke up to this one. Man, people are out looking for their eclipse glasses and lining up to try to get some. It's just kind of nuts. I've never seen so much energy around an eclipse.
Yeah, I think people like to get excited about things, and this is the perfect excuse right now. Something positive to get excited about, at least.
Yeah. Well, in the Adventure Sports Podcast, we're all about connecting with nature, and usually that means that, you're out somewhere away from all the urban stuff, and you're enjoying what nature has to offer, whether that's the desert or the forest or the mountains or whatever, but this is a part of connecting with nature that we can kind of all do en masse when we realize in such a cool way that the moon and the sun are moving with the earth, and it creates these sorts of weird phenomena. I mean, it's not that amazing of a thing when you think, well, the moon just goes in front of the sun, and that's part of the reason why I'm like, well, what's all the hype about? But here's something that you might not know. I'm going to throw this out there just in case our listeners haven't really thought about it. The moon in the sky, from our perspective, is the same size as the sun from our perspective. And roughly, it's because the sun is a diameter 400 times bigger than the moon, but it's 400 times farther away. So it just happens to line up that they're the same size. And here's the weird part of that. No other moon satellite on any planet in the solar system is like that. And as far as we know, there may not be another scenario like that around other stars very frequently either. It's possible that what we have on Earth, with our moon being this exact size and being this exact distance from the Earth and the moon being this exact distance from the sun, so that this happens this way, it might be one of those 1 in a trillion sort of things.
That's wild.
Yeah. So I kind of wonder about that, especially, and I'm not going to go on about it, but in the past, you get some ancient astronomer who figures out that this is going to happen, and then he stands up in front of the people and says, "I'm a god. You have to obey me. I'm gonna black out the sun." Those weird historical events when people would manipulate people with fear because of this. And I think all of that history couldn't have happened had the Earth and the Moon and the Sun been configured any differently than they are. So I don't know, just kind of a weird thing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of people out there right now looking at the eclipse thinking all sorts of crazy religious things as well.
Yeah. Well, it is cool. And I said this on other shows before. We look at a natural phenomena and you can explain it all away with science, or you can go out and experience it and you go, whoa, that's really cool. And it's the whoa, really cool part, I think, that sometimes matters, because how it impacts us is our experience. And man,
Absolutely.
I don't know, you probably have experienced this too, but I've been in nature and I've experienced some stuff that's so rare and so weird that you think, I don't think anyone would believe me if I told them. And those moments, they feel magical. Even though we can explain the science behind it, they still feel magical.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
anyway.
I mean, that's part of the, joy of going out, is seeing something that totally blows your mind.
Yeah.
That you would totally have missed if you would have stuck around town.
Oh, exactly. Well, right now, the eclipse is pretty cool out my window. It's getting darker and darker and darker, but that's not what the show's about. I just wanted to share that with our listeners, because if I stop in the middle and go, oh, man, you'll know what I'm talking about. All the neighbors are running outside now. And
geez.
Half of them look like they're burning out their retinas, or they don't have their glasses. Careful.
Well, I appreciate you sacrificing this, extremely important moment to talk to me. It's an honor.
I'm a part of it. I'm watching it happen. So let's go back to Graham Hiemstra. So Graham, you grew up in Portland, and then you spent some time in Seattle, and you moved to New York. And
that's right.
That's a huge transition. Let's start with what got you interested in the outdoors and adventure sports.
Sure, yeah. Well, I was fortunate enough to grow up in a place where just being outside is pretty commonplace, and I had a forest in my backyard, every house I grew up in, deer and, bear eating the bird seed and that sort of thing. Even though I was just minutes from downtown Portland and Seattle. So just being outside has just always been just a common thread in my life. I specifically got super into just being outside in high school. I got really into snowboarding, and that stayed as a common thread for many years. I sort of chased that dream, traveled around, lived in New Zealand for a little while. Then it became pretty apparent that all my friends were way better than me, and I should go to college and, wise up and actually better my life through that instead of just getting hurt all the time. So, but, even when I wasn't snowboarding, I grew up skateboarding, I grew up riding bikes. I just always grew up being outside. So it's just always been something I've been interested in. And then went to University of Oregon right around the time I sort of stopped snowboarding super heavily. One of my best friends got a job right out of college, moved to New York to work in an architecture firm, and I was living in Portland at the time. This was 7-8 years ago. Portland was a lot less exciting then. It was not the topic of conversation, and there were not that many jobs. It was a very overeducated, underemployed type of place when I was there. And so I just wound up moving to New York sort of on a whim. I was like, all right, well, let's just see what the hell happens here. So grabbed a couple skateboards and a backpack and moved out east with no real plan. I had studied psychology in college and didn't really know what I was going to do with that. Didn't really want to go to 8 more years of school to wind up a family therapist or something. And so I wound up in New York and, sort of long story short, got into working in magazines and both digital and physical, and kind of here I am now.
Wow. So New York was kind of a big adventure for you. It's like, well, let's just see what life will be like.
Yeah, and growing up in the Northwest, speaking for myself, and I think a lot of people feel similarly, but I have a lot of pride in the Northwest, and I never really thought of places outside of it. I always thought, this is the place for me. I love it here. And then I visited New York to visit that friend in midway through college, and like I said, I knew it was a place far away. I never really thought anything about it. And I visited and I was like, oh, this place is amazing. I have to live here. It was really strange. I've never experienced anything like that. So yeah, I just felt really drawn, and I've always kind of felt like I walked too fast for Portland anyways. Actually,
okay.
Kind of literally. And, so I came out to New York and totally on a whim, but the pace of life here and the amount of people doing amazing things, and I think really just makes a great fit.
Well, maybe you can answer a couple of questions I've had for a long time.
All right.
We get a lot of downloads from the state of New York. Can't see where they come from in New York, but what we've found, of course, is we get more downloads from population centers, and New York certainly has that. But here's the thing that's amazing. Upstate New York, very natural, very beautiful. People are used to hearing about that, but most of the population's going to be in the city, and New York City is not super close to most kind of rugged outback adventure sports. So there's a stereotype, and you can bash that if you need to. But the question I have is, we also sell a lot of our 180 stoves to people in New York City. I'm like, okay, where are these people going? What are they doing? How are they getting from the city to where they do their adventures?
Totally. Well, I think that one thing that people forget is that New York is more or less a beach town. I mean, the ocean is a 40-minute subway ride away.
Right.
Yeah, it's kind of gross. But if you go farther out on Long Island, it gets really beautiful. And, you can take a train. There's public transportation that goes all the way up the Hudson Valley, and you can jump on a train at Penn Station in the middle of Manhattan. And an hour and a half later, be in a pretty beautiful, pretty remote area where you can hike and camp without even really having a car. So, the surf scene in recent years has really blown up in New York, and which is crazy. And people have a hard time wrapping their heads around that. But if you live here, you start to see it, and you can take the subway to the beach. You see people on the subway with surfboards. It's really wild.
Oh, that's great.
And, one thing I always say, and I think a lot of people feel similarly, but for me, the only way for me to survive living in New York is to leave every opportunity I get. And so I'm fortunate enough, my folks are still in Portland. I have a lot of other family in Seattle. And so I get back to Northwest, often, a handful of times a year. And I think leaving the city really makes you appreciate how great the city actually is. And that could be even just like going to the beach for a day. It doesn't have to be extreme trips. But I think there's a lot of people who live in New York that really love like going hard and working all the time and really enjoying the city for all it has, but then they need that exact opposite, and they do go outside. So maybe that helps clear things up.
Yeah, well, it's very, very cool, and it's a beautiful trend. It's exactly what the Adventure Sports Podcast is trying to promote. It's that people do take the time to go connect with nature, even if they live in the heart of a huge metropolitan area like New York. And, the reality is we interview a lot of people from London or other cities around the world who are doing the same sort of a thing. They're jumping on a subway and bugging out of town and doing the weekend warrior bit. I love it. I think that it's a healthy thing for people, and I also love it because it illustrates that even if you live in one of the biggest cities in the United States, one of the biggest cities on the planet, you can still go connect with nature regularly. Well, that's what we ought to be doing. I think that matters, and I think it's beautiful.
Absolutely. 100% agree.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, thanks for clearing that up. So,
yeah, of course.
Graham, let's talk about the Oregon Outback Trail. I mean, I don't know much about this trail at all. So, fill us in. Where does it go, and what's it like?
Well, to tell you the truth, I didn't know a lot about it either until I went. I tend to do this thing where people invite me on crazy trips and I sort of just say yes, and then I don't really do my homework. I get too preoccupied with other work or whatever excuse. And then I just wind up totally out in some wild place, potentially over my head. And then it turns into an adventure and I get good stories out of it. So generally it works out. But this trip in particular, so the Oregon Outback Trail, it's 364 miles, extends basically the entire length of Oregon, from Klamath Falls, Oregon, which is roughly on the California border, right near it, all the way up to the Columbia River, which divides Oregon and Washington. And it goes through central Oregon, which is a lot of different types of terrain, but a lot of it is desert-like. People think of Oregon and they think of big lush trees, but the whole Northwest really is divided into the western third where the Cascades are, that's lush. And then the eastern third of Oregon and Washington gets super high desert, hot in the summer, cold in the winter. And so we were going through a portion actually called the Oregon Outback, and it's super deserted. There's nothing out there. Tiny little ghost towns of 100 people, rattlesnakes and all sorts of, wildlife. And so it makes for quite the incredible bikepacking trip because you're largely unsupported. And it just you get to see parts of the state that, most people don't ever get to see. Yeah. So growing up in, Western Oregon, I got to see a lot of the beautiful state there, but Eastern Oregon and Central Oregon, were really new to me. And so that was a big draw, was to go out and see a portion of the state, my home state that I had never explored before.
Wow. So that's pretty cool. And that it's also highlights something that happened to me. I grew up in Oklahoma, northeastern Oklahoma, green country. It's called that to try to differentiate it from, the red plains and more dry, open area of western Oklahoma. But green country is heavily forested in the foothills of the Ozarks. But I grew up there and it was just normal. Didn't think much about it. Moved to Colorado for about a year. Moved back to Oklahoma to finish school. And the reason I bring it up is because when I left Colorado, I just totally fall in love with Colorado. Mm-hmm. And so when I went back to Oklahoma, I was like, oh man, I am going to miss this so much. I mean, it was tough because I was craving more of what Colorado had to offer. But I said, okay, well, I know that northeastern Oklahoma has some cool stuff too. I probably never have looked. I'm going to make sure that I take the time to open my eyes and experience it. And I had more fun discovering things where I had grown up than I ever thought or dreamed that I would. So many amazing natural wonders and great places to go out and do adventure sports and fun things. And a lot of stuff is there that's not in Colorado. But the reason I bring it up is you kind of had that similar experience. So you're going back to Oregon, but you're seeing parts of Oregon you've never seen before and experiencing something brand new.
Absolutely. I think that a lot of people get this feeling that they need to go on far-flung adventures, or travel to Iceland to see something crazy.
Right.
And yeah, that is a great way to experience something new, but there's so much. America is an incredibly diverse place, geographically and whatnot, and there's just so much good stuff that we all tend to overlook. So I've been trying to spend more time just kind of exploring stuff right in my own backyard.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm glad that you brought that up because it's a good testimony. Adventure's everywhere. Nature's everywhere. You just have to open your eyes a little bit and realize what you take for granted because you've always been there. That might be something really amazing if you take a minute to kind of explore it and experience it in a new way. So very, very cool. Well, you do us the favor of kind of describing the topography and the vegetation and stuff that you're going to experience on the Oregon Outback Trail, just kind of from start to finish. You did 6 days of this. So how did the landscape change?
Well, it was almost changing every 30 or 40 miles or so. And that sounds crazy, but It's actually kind of true. You start out in sort of farmland, and day one can be kind of frustrating because you're actually going through. You're on a rails to trails, so it's old locomotive track that they've turned to bike trails.
Right
but
on.
It's amazing. But it bisects all these farmlands, so you're constantly stopping and opening gates and going over cattle guards and things like that. Which on day one you think is the most annoying thing, and then by day two you would kill to have the gates back if you just could stop riding hills. And so, day one, you're going through cow pastures and stuff, and flicking up cow crap on each other, and it's it's fun. And then you start gaining, you get farther up in the state, and you wind up going into some national forests, and then you basically get into flat desert. You go by this incredible natural phenomenon called Fort Rock, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's like a giant crater-like rock formation that jets up straight out of the ground, and that's pretty wild. And then right after that, you basically run into the Ochiko Mountains, which is a pretty awesome and hilly area of old growth. You're going through lava fields just before that, and a bit after, you're getting bright red dirt, you're getting super dark dirt, you're getting ponderosa pines, it's really incredible, really the different types of terrain and flora that you get to see. I was sort of saying I wish I had just periodically stopped and taken photos of my feet or something on the ground, because you go through so many different types of soil and different colors. It would have made for a really cool photo essay. So maybe next time.
Oh yeah, that's fun. By now you certainly know who Bent Gate is. That's for a great reason. Bent Gate Mountaineering has been sponsoring the Adventure Sports Podcast almost from the beginning, and we really appreciate that. They've made it possible for all the great shows to continue coming your way. We want to say thanks by reminding you to go to them for your backcountry gear. If you live in Colorado, then just stop by their store in Golden. If not, go to bentgate.com. They have what you need, from the latest ultralight gear to the tried and true classics for climbing, hiking, and camping, like Arc'teryx, Hilleberg, Nemo, Western Mountaineering, and many more. Need advice? They have you covered there too. Their staff are passionate adventurers who can offer help from their own experiences. Bentgate also hosts lots of events and speakers. Check out their website to see the schedule and to see all of their products. Help take care of the Adventure Sports Podcast by getting your gear from Bentgate Mountaineering. So since it's a railroad grade, that means it can't be super steep, but you said it was pretty hilly.
Well, thanks for catching that. The Rails to Trails ends pretty much at the end of day one. So we did it in six days. Right. So day one was like, oh, this can't be that bad. And then you basically are traversing through the state, through various different mountain ranges and things. And I mean, in total, there's almost 15,000 feet of ascents over, 364 miles. So it gets pretty serious. There's multiple days where we're climbing almost, 4,500 feet over about 70 miles a day.
Okay.
So, and, it's funny, there was a lot of takeaways, and one of them was it's possible to spend all day climbing and wind up with a net elevation loss. All we did on day two was these rolling hills where it was a real gradual ascent and then a steep descent, and then a real gradual ascent, steep descent. And so that really kind of, for me, screwed with my head, because it's like all you're doing is climbing at a real slow speed, and then you get these quick moments to recover that you don't actually recover from.
Yeah,
so
you climb for an hour and go downhill for 3 minutes, and then you climb for an hour, and I get it.
Yeah, it was pretty unrelenting. And I don't actually. I mean, I didn't train for this, and that was a pretty serious mistake. I was with 3 other friends who, are pretty big badasses, and they were definitely in better shape than I was. I was lagging the whole time, which, just adds to the storyline. But most of my days, I commute by bike, but, I could ride 15 miles in a day just running errands. But that's much different than being out on gravel. So most of the Oregon Outback Trail is about 75, 80% unpaved. So it's gravel, it's dirt, it's, all you can imagine there. So, yeah, to say I was underprepared would be an understatement.
Cool. Well, you know what? I'm going to pause in the conversation for about 10 seconds here and give an Eclipse update. So right now I'm watching people outside trying to make shadows and stuff of the eclipse, and you get this little crescent sun mark. Everything else is, just, it's kind of like the moon, except as a inversion somehow. I don't know. It's wild, but we're at probably the peak of the eclipse here. So we're like 85%. And what it looks like is, if someone has a really bad window tinting job on their car and it's just way too dark, you step outside and you blink your eyes. You want to clean your glasses because it looks just like that. Like the whole world has been tinted too much.
Huh.
But pretty fun.
Very cool.
Anyway, just wanted to give you that update. So, it sounds like the Oregon Outback Trail is pretty cool. You did bike packing on it. Did you see a lot of hikers on it?
No, so it's mostly a bikepacking trail. And it's really not a designated trail in the sense that there's markers and things. It's more just a network of roads. And so we had, GPS tracking to try and figure out, because there are portions where you go through little towns and you're going on paved roads, little county roads and such. So that's one thing, is you really always have to be on your toes.
Okay.
Paying attention. So yeah, it was started a handful of years ago. I think they did an organized ride for maybe 2 years. And hundreds of people did it. I think a guy did it in like a day and a half, or maybe even just gone straight through, which was pretty wild. And, so it's more just a network of roads and trails that all sort of line up. And we did see some other bike packers on it. There was a really cool older couple, and they're about 50s. And they were really badass. They made all their own bike packing, like the frame bags and things. And, but we actually ran into them about on day 4 in Prineville, which is a cool little town that has a great little bike shop, called Good Bike Co. And they've got, coffee and beers, and they're sort of a hub for bike packing in that area. We ran into the older couple there, and they were like, it's just too hard. And I think they might have been thrown in the towel, which was a bit of a shame. But, one thing that I forgot to mention, which is crazy because it basically set the tone for this entire trip, is that we did it in early June, which you would assume that you're going to get great weather. Forecast the week before we went and the week after was highs in the 80s, lows in, 50s. The day we started, it was about 30 something degrees in the morning.
Ouch.
And a crazy storm had come in, and basically for the entire 6 days, we just got rained on, hailed on. We even saw snow on day 2 for a half a second, which was crazy. And so, yeah, the terrain was tough, but I think that the weather and the wind and the driving rain and stuff, that really made it significantly more difficult. And it was totally out of season, unexpected.
Well, and that's the worst, is when you're kind of hovering around freezing and you get rain and snow mixed, and that super cold wind and everything's wet because it's not cold enough to dry out. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
That's the very worst temperature to do anything in outside without the right gear. I mean, it's tough.
Yeah. The term Type 2 fun got tossed around quite a bit.
Wow. Well, this is cool. I'm learning a ton about the Oregon Outback Trail. So what you're saying is it's primarily a bike route. And
Correct.
it's kind of similar to, like, people talk about the Great Divide Trail. I'm not talking about the Continental Divide Trail. I'm talking about the bike route, the Great Divide Trail, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's more of a route than it is necessarily just one trail with signage or something like the Appalachian Trail might be. But what a cool thing. So how many people are using this trail for bikepacking? Is it pretty popular, or do you think that it's a little underused?
I don't know the exact numbers. I would assume that it's probably, a couple hundred people a year are doing the whole thing. I think that people probably do sections as well. What's great is that the way that we did it, and I think the way a lot of people do it, is that you can take an Amtrak from Portland down to Klamath Falls and then just start there. And then you wind up in the Dalles out near Hood River, which is about, an hour and a half or so from Portland. So if you get a shuttle back from there, then it's a pretty seamless round trip. And like I said, that bike shop in Prineville is really sort of set themselves up as a hub for bikepacking. So they've done some organized promotion of the Oregon Outback Trail and things. I think bikepacking in general is getting more popular. I had never really done it. I had done little sort of overnights here and there, but this was absolutely my first attempt at something more serious. And, it was a blast. It was really cool. I mean, it was basically the combination of all the best things about backpacking, but you get to cover more ground and see more things and meet cooler people.
Yeah, that's fun. We've had several bike packers on the show, and also, roadies that are using panniers and stuff to do distances and travel the world, which is awesome. I kind of like the idea of bike packing and how it's developing. The way that people get gear onto the bike so it's more aerodynamic and so it can stand up to the abuse that you get mountain biking essentially on rough trails, instead of using panniers that don't seem to hold up to that kind of abuse. But what was your kit like? Were you set up like a true mountain bike packing setup, or was it more of a pannier setup?
It was more, it was definite bike packing setup. We had the folks at Ortlieb, who is best known for making panniers. They recently made a whole set of bikepacking frame bags and C-post bag and things like that. And so they hooked us up, and those were pretty great. I did bust a zipper halfway through, but luckily most of the worst weather was already past us. But it's pretty incredible how much you can put on a bike and still ride it pretty uninhibited. I think it really opens up a lot of doors there for different types of traveling and exploring.
I think most people are familiar with the kit that you see with panniers, because people have seen travelers with panniers for years. But since bikepacking is newer, it's been around, but it's newer. I haven't seen that many in person. I've seen several, but not that many, really in comparison. So describe where the gear is going and how the bag's set up a little bit, just so people get a feel for what we're talking about. It really is different. Yeah,
absolutely. We had a large sort of Tootsie Roll style bag that goes on the handlebars. We have drop bars like a road bike. And so right in front there, that's where we sort of put our sleeping bag and maybe a cooking pot or something, nest those together in there. And then on top of that, a tiny little accessory bag that we just jammed full of, honey stinger bars and Cliff bars and all that stuff, which I never want to eat again because I ate way too many of them. That's one advice. Bring more real food. And then a large frame bag that took up, the entire space pretty much in the triangle in your frame there, between the down tube and all that. And then probably the biggest bag actually connects sticking off almost like a rooster tail from your seat post underneath your seat and almost acting like a large fender. And that's where we stuck tents and some of the bigger items. And that was basically it. One of the other friends I was with was a photographer, and so he had some panniers as well. But yeah, it's really impressive how much that you can really jam in there. But it also, test your limits on how much you can refine your packing list.
Yeah, it's a lot less gear space than a good sized backpack would offer, but it's enough gear space that people can do it, and that's what's cool. You kind of have to get into the minimalist, ultralight kind of an approach, I think, to make it really work.
Absolutely, and the nice thing about this whole setup, the trail rather, is that you're almost daily running through these tiny little towns with a gas station at least, or a little mercantile or something like that. So we didn't have to carry much food, which was huge. And we actually ate pretty well. There's this amazing diner restaurant in the middle of nowhere, absolute nowhere, on day 2 called the Cowboy Dinner Tree. And you have to call ahead. I would not recommend it for vegetarians because the only thing they serve is either a 30-ounce steak or a whole roasted chicken.
Wow.
And yeah, it's pretty incredible. And so that was definitely, day 2 was the hardest day, really bad weather, tons of climbing. But at the end of the day, we just knew that we were going to wrap up with an incredible steak dinner at this really bizarre old cowboy restaurant. And so that was really neat.
Hey, that's fun. So was this your first bike packing trip?
Yeah, I had done a couple smaller ones, like an overnight or something, really just more like adventure biking day stuff. But this was absolutely my first attempt at more than one night bike packing. So yes, actually, for all 4 of us, it was really, for all intents and purposes, the first bike packing trip.
Wow.
So we really started full on.
I've talked to several bike packers who described what it was like to get into the sport, and it's kind of a painful point of entry, but then they fall in love with it, and some of them, have traveled the planet that way because they love it so much. But what was your take on it? First trip, first time out. Did you think it was a great thing to do, or be more reserved, I guess?
No, absolutely. I loved it. I have done quite a bit of long motorcycle camping trips. I went from New York to LA a handful of years ago, and I'm sort of around Lake Michigan and things like that. And so I had similar experience with just like packing tons of junk onto a bike and going. Obviously, this is significantly different. But, after doing my first bike packing trip, I definitely loved it. And I would absolutely suggest to anyone that can get their hands on the gear to do it.
Yeah,
I would love to do more of it.
It's cool. So I love mountain biking, and we spend a lot of time doing that. And I've been wanting to block out some time and get the right gear and see what kind of distance we can cover just in the Colorado Rockies without getting on a road. So I'd love to give that a try, and we'll do it one of these days. But it's one of those, those dream trips. We're going to make it happen.
Yeah. Well, I guess my advice for that would just to be, say yes to any invite you might get. This whole thing came about because a friend of mine out in Bend, Oregon, who works at Hydro Flask, I had been emailing with him, and he said, hey, me and a couple pals are doing this trip. Do you want to come? And I had an opening in my calendar, and I just said yes. So thank goodness they put most of it together, and I jumped along. And, had I actually done my research, maybe I would have been more hesitant. But, in this opportunity, the blind confidence there definitely worked out, and I'm happy that I did it.
So you heard it from Graham Hiemstra. Just say yes when it comes to this. That's awesome. That's cool. Well, hey, you said that day 2 especially got gnarly and the weather and all that. Will you walk us through it? Just take us there. Tell us the story so we can hear the details.
Yeah, sure. So day 2, we woke up. We ended up sort of just dipping into the woods and camping at know on a national forest there, just in not a campground. But we woke up to a little bit of rain, and about 7 a.m., packed up all of our stuff, had a soggy morning, and then we hit the road and started out going through a volcanic area. It's super beautiful, it's fun, weather was all right. And then right around noon or so, once we'd gotten maybe 20 miles, 30 miles under our belt, it just started raining. And if you ever spent any time in the Northwest, you know that the rains are not really, they don't really blow through. Once they're there to stay. So we got all of our rain gear on and, just kept pedaling. And it just didn't ever stop. The hills, like I mentioned earlier, the hills were just rolling, and they were, luckily a good portion of it was on pavement, but the temperatures were low. I'd say upper 30s, low 40s, and there was wind, and there was, sleet, and it was cold. And the thing is we had that reservation at the Cowboy Dinner Tree, and we didn't want to miss it. And so that was the biggest driving force is, we had to hit these mile markers. And so we just kept pushing. We got to a point where I can definitively say I've never been more mentally and physically exhausted. I've done a lot of adventuring in my day, and this was gnarly. In the moment, I was trying to think of, to sort of bring, get my spirits higher. I was trying to think of, I guarantee I've been in this, worse situation. And I couldn't think of it then, and I honestly don't think I can think of a tougher one now. And there was a moment where, I sort of found myself alone because I had fallen back, and a buddy, one of the Bo, had turned around and ridden back to me, and a lot of the trail, you don't really need to wear a helmet because you're going at low speeds. You're kind of just going on flat ground, like, you're not really going to tip over. I got to a point where I needed to put my helmet on because I was so unsteady and so just like totally bonked, just so out of energy that I was concerned that I was just going to tip over at any moment.
Yikes.
And it was pouring rain, and there was a moment where I had to just get off my bike and just lay down. And I just laid down in the middle of this trail, in the middle of nowhere, Oregon, in the pouring rain, and just like jammed a Cliff Bar down my throat, trying to get some energy as the rain just poured down on my face. And that was actually a theme that started as I realized that 5 minutes of rest laying down is better than 15 minutes of standing rest.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no doubt.
And I just, luckily that few moments of laying there in the rain sort of gave a little bit of clarity, and we only had about 15 miles, which doesn't sound like a ton, but when you're really only pedaling 8 miles an hour, 15 miles is still quite a ways to go.
Right.
But, the crew that I was with was super positive, and everyone was feeling the same stuff. And so we all sort of, cheered each other on. But yeah, there was a moment, even just after that, there was a serious descent, and my hands were so cold and so wet that I couldn't shift. I was actually like slapping my hand on the bar end shifters to get them to go up and down because I couldn't. And I was going down this descent that was pretty windy. And it was actually probably the most beautiful portion of the trip. And I was so bummed that I couldn't get my camera out, but I couldn't even move my hands to the point of grabbing the brakes. And that really scared me. I had to stop and put my hands in my pants to warm myself up there for about 10 minutes. But that was pretty spooky.
Never run out of camp stove fuel again. The 180 stove is a natural fuel stove that eliminates the need to carry heavy, bulky fuel canisters. With a generous 6-inch by 7-inch cooking surface, it folds away into a clean, compact, self-forming case that is small enough to fit inside your pocket. At only 10.4 ounces, the additional weight and space savings allows for other important items in your pack. Get more information at 180tac.com and look for it in retailers near you as well as online.
Well, that sounds wild. I want to make one point. You know, you guys were a team. You guys were looking out for each other. And like you said, that 5 minutes made a huge difference to being able to lay down. But I wanted to point out, in conditions like that, where it's prime conditions for hypothermia, if you're alone, don't lay down unless you're in a warm spot. I'm just telling everybody, because you may not get back up again, because that's kind of one of the steps of hypothermia, is you get to the point where you just your mind kind of quits reasoning clearly and you just want to stop. And so, but it worked for you, and you guys had a team there. You're looking out for each other, so I totally agree with everything you did. But I just wanted to point that out to the listeners.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's super important. Yeah, and I admit that I should have been better prepared for this trip. And there was moments like that on that, specifically on day 2, where I was definitely over my head. But I was just super thankful, luckily, to be with 3 pals that were, pretty serious athletes and experienced outdoorsmen. And so, we kept each other going there. And that actually leads to, one of the biggest takeaways was, like, don't be embarrassed or think twice about making a smart decision to save the trip. Because after we got done with the cowboy dinner tree, we were all still so exhausted that there was a hotel nearby, and we went and stayed there for the night and dried out and dried our tents, and were able to get a decent night's sleep. And had we gone and just pitched tents and crawled in there wet, that could have been really scary and dangerous. And so, our ego said, well, we set out to camp and we want to camp, but we had to make that smart decision to just ditch it and stay in a hotel for a night. So that was a big takeaway, is,
Yeah, and the funny part is, had it been 10 degrees colder, you guys would have been warmer. But that's just the way it is.
Yeah, that's probably true.
Yeah, that's wild, man. Mother Nature sometimes changes our plans, and that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. You just gotta be fluid, and I think that's one of the most fun things about doing these big trips like this, is that you need to just sort of surrender to reacting to the actual situation. And if you set out to hit 70 miles a day, but you only hit 55, that's fine. Just take it as it goes, and don't unnecessarily push yourself into a situation where you might end up getting even more sketchy.
I have a theory that had the weather been perfect all the way through, you would look back on the trip someday 10 years from now and say, yeah, well, we biked a long way back then somewhere.
Right.
But
yeah,
now
absolutely.
you've got the full story. It's like, oh man, remember that day?
Yeah, I mean, there's almost too many stories to tell from this trip. I'm sure all my friends and family are sick of hearing about it. I only had about 3 days to just hit them with all the stories, and now no one wants to hear about it anymore. So I appreciate you taking the time.
Very cool. Well, tell us what it was like when you were having a really good day on this trip, a highlight that just seemed really, really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely have to say that the whole trip, we thought it would get easier, and it didn't. It never got as hard as day 2, but it never really got easy. But I think that it comes a point where you're fine with the way that, it's tough, but that's sort of part of the fun. And for us, I think it was day 3. It's day 5. We had the toughest day as far as ascent, total elevation gain. It was almost 5,000 feet, but it was sunny and it was finally warm. It was the first time I wore a short sleeve shirt the whole time, the only time. And we were in this incredible area, quite getting up there north towards this area called Antelope. And we had finally reached the top of this extreme climb, a 2-hour climb or whatever. And we're on the middle of nowhere. And all of a sudden a pickup truck comes out, sort of rattling up behind us. And this old man rolls down his window and he turns to us. He's got his dog sitting on the bench seat next to him. And he turns to us and says, "She thinks you're crazy and I think you're idiots." And then just erupts laughing and just drives off. We're like, what the heck was that? Like, this crazy old man. And so we get a laugh out of that, and we keep going for a bit. And we're sort of starting to realize we're running out of water. And so one of the guys on the crew is this guy named Bo, who grew up out in Kansas, and a real great people person. I mean, he could talk to anyone. He could sweet talk anybody. So we go, all right, Bo, you got to go and knock on a door. So we were in this pretty remote area, but there were some houses. So he goes, knocks on a door, and asks this super friendly older woman if we can fill up her water bottles with her hose. She says yes. We go up there, and she says, well, my husband's usually here. He'd usually be the one handling this, but he's out patrolling the hills. He thinks he's the sheriff around here. And right on cue, the old man that had talked to us a few minutes earlier rolls up in his pickup truck. And he jumps out, and he's giving us all this fake attitude, joking around. And he's like, looks like you guys could use a beer, and goes in and gets some beers for us. And we end up talking to this man. He's a 8th generation Oregonian. His great-great-grandfather had homesteaded the land that they were on. They had some 4,000 acres where they drive cattle and stuff. And I mean, these are, some pretty bad SOBs, and tough family, but so friendly. And we ended up hanging out with them for an hour. And at that moment, we knew we weren't going to reach our mileage. But we were like, I mean, this is such a cool experience. Screw the mileage. We want to just hang out and have a beer with this older couple and watch them bicker at each other and, crack jokes. And I think that was a really cool thing. Is for me, the biggest takeaways from this trip were, it was tough and it was really cool, but we met so many incredible people. And so many people were so kind to us that we had to sort of remember that, so much of our society and the way that a lot of people are raised leads you to believe that strangers are bad.
Right.
And we experienced so much kindness and so much generosity from just totally random people that knew nothing about us, but they thought that what we were doing was interesting and curious, or they were just being nice, and that was the coolest part of any day. And specifically the coolest part of the trip for me was just meeting this older couple and hearing about their lives and what it's like to live in the middle of nowhere, Oregon. So maybe that doesn't answer your question, but that was a pretty good day.
Oh, no, that's a great answer. I have to chuckle because I've heard it several times where people say, we thought this was going to be about the trip. It ended up being about the people.
Mm-hmm.
People start out thinking, I'm going to bike this far in this period of time, and I'm going to see all this stuff, and it's going to be cool, and it's all about the biking. And the reality is no, it's about the people you meet along the way. And it kind of becomes the highlight. So I'm glad you shared that. I think it's awesome, and I think it's real. So don't you wish you would have stayed home and not gone?
Yeah, I would have had probably gained some weight instead of losing some, but no, I'm so happy that I put myself through all that and went. It was a blast.
Well, Just Say Yes Graham says just say yes to doing stuff like this. I love it. Well, dude, you mentioned earlier your digital publication. You just kind of mentioned it in passing, but you've got a resource that our listeners should check out. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so a handful of years ago, after I moved to New York, I've been working in different magazines, working in writing about design and writing about fashion and writing about outdoors and doing all these things. And I kind of thought, well, I think there's a lot of people like myself that live in cities and that care about good design, but also love to go outside and go on adventures and things. So I started this digital publication called The Field, and it's fieldmag.com. And we publish a modest amount of content, all original content, photo essays, gear reviews, and features, trip recaps, designer Q&As, and things like that. really the idea is to just try and create a resource and a place for people to, as a place to see the outdoors in a more accessible light, and to just, see some beautiful photography, learn about some cool new gear. So yeah, our approach with the Field is there are a lot of really core endemic outdoor publications, and they're great. But if you're new to the outdoors, you didn't grow up in them, or maybe you don't really care how much, that carabiner weighs or whatever, we want to be a resource for people that are looking for something that's a little less intense, a little less intimidating, but still shows like the beautiful photography and the beautiful outdoors and really cool gear that, you can get out and go on adventures yourself with.
So a great way to start out, it sounds like, getting into the adventure space.
Yeah, I think that I don't entirely know the skill level and the experience level of our audience. I wish I did. But I would assume that most of our, a lot of our readers are sort of weekend warriors, and as I now living in New York, I've sort of become that as well. And I think that expression sort of used to have, or maybe still does have, a negative connotation. But the reality is, I would love to spend every day outside, but I can't because I'm a real adult and I have to pay rent.
Right.
And so, we just want to encourage people to get outside and, try something that they haven't done, or, maybe learn more about something that they already know. So, we're not necessarily targeting beginners or experts, but we're just trying to be a resource for folks that are interested in good design and the great outdoors.
Right on. So that's fieldmag.com, right?
Correct.
And if people want to get more information about your bike trip that you did on the Oregon Outback Trail, did you guys blog any of that? Yeah,
we did. I shot a photo essay. It's all shot on 35 millimeter film that turned out pretty well, that I'm happy with. And then we also did sort of a longer what I learned feature, and that breaks it down day by day, talks about a lot of the things that I went over. And so, yeah, if you go to fieldmag.com and click on photo essays or click on features in the menu there, then, you'll see what I'm talking about and hopefully be entertained.
Right on. So if you are interested in learning more about the trail or maybe doing the trail yourself sometime, then make your way over to Graham's fieldmag.com and you can be able to see what his trip was like. That's very cool. Thanks for sharing it, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for inviting me on to talk about it.
Yeah, you bet. So fieldmag.com, I got to look over it a little bit. It's good quality stuff. And I didn't get to explore as in-depth as I will. That's going to happen. But thanks a lot, Graham, for putting the time and the energy into it so that other people can have a great resource like that.
Absolutely. It's a lot of fun. So, it's not too big of an ask.
Right on. Well, Graham, thanks also for your time today and for educating me on the Oregon Outback Trail. I didn't know anything about it, and now I do, and it sounds like a fantastic bikepacking resource for people. And we appreciate the time you took to share it with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And, I hope I didn't make it sound too intimidating or too scary. It's definitely an amazing way to see Oregon, and just hope you have better luck with the weather than I did.
I'm sure a lot of people will. Well, and for all the listeners out there, here's another way that you can get out there and have some fun. The Oregon Outback Trail, and check out Graham's site, fieldmag.com. Thanks for listening today. And as always, do get out there and have some fun.
Coming up on Monday's show, Scott Pierce and his wife Jo Roxy moved to the United States from Australia and decided to cycle across the country to get acquainted with their new home. You don't want to miss that one. Until then, get out and have some fun.